So I'm pretty old-fashioned for being on the older end of the millennial spectrum. As you can see, I have my lovely whiteboard instead of multimedia because I didn't want slides to be distracting. And in my experience working with many men, I know that it's hard to multitask, right? So if I had a lot of words on a screen behind me, and that's not a knock on you, but I've just come to understand from working with men in my professional career that you need to focus on one thing. So I figured rather than take away from the content that I will be discussing, I have a list of all of the scripture references I'm going to use today, have an illustration here, some of the major concepts. So if it would be helpful to you, feel free to take a snapshot with your phone. You can come up afterwards if that would be easier. I also have my contact information up top, which I definitely want you to reach out and use it should you desire to contact me afterwards with follow-up questions or other things. So don't forget about those cards. I believe that John, did you hand out index cards? So again, as a reminder, please, please, please write down questions if you have them. Unfortunately, for the sake of time, because I'm going to try to cram a lot of content into the short time we have together today, I probably won't have time to take questions at the end. We'll see. But definitely hand those in to John or Seth, and they can give them to me, and then we can always assess if there's enough content that we should do a part 2. So thank you for allowing me to be here today. John tells me I'm the inaugural female speaker at the men's breakfast, so I feel very honored by that. Thank you. But really, in all sincerity, Seth and I have been so grateful since we've been in Colorado to be a part of Cornerstone because of things like this, that John and Brian and so many others in leadership really champion these types of events, that we talk about these kinds of subjects, which I think are so important in our culture today. I mean, I think you all would agree with that. So thank you for the opportunity. So my husband shared a little bit about my passion for this subject, but a lot of people ask me, how did you come, to work in this field? So I'll just give you a little brief description of my background. I cannot tell you how many people have come up to me since they've been advertising this talk, and girls and women and men alike, and all of these people have said to me, wow, you are so brave to talk about sex in front of all of the men. And my response to that would be, it's not brave. It takes a little bit of courage, I suppose, but I really feel like this is just the door that God has opened, and that's kind of been the story of my whole life and my career. So I'm actually very comfortable working with men. I've worked with more men than women in my counseling career. You might be surprised to hear. So I'll just give you a little bit of my background, and I think it's just him dropping these opportunities in my lap and just walking through that door. So I had a career prior to this, actually, both doing skincare and then in business management and some consulting before I shifted over to the counseling world. And after I went back to school for my master's, actually, in marriage and family therapy, so that's my designation and my training, I was actually at a boys group home, so working at a Christian boys group home for adolescent youth, just working with a lot of trauma. And then I also was at the VA hospital where I worked with a lot of combat veterans, primarily a Vietnam era, as well as their wives, on PTSD and the impact of that on their mental health, but specifically focusing in on the couple relationship. So I kind of had the spectrum of pre-adolescence, adolescence, and then all the way to the older generations. And then when I moved into private practice, I do definitely see individuals. I definitely see women as well, enjoy working with women. But with my specialty as a marriage and family therapist, I obviously see a lot of couples. That's where my heart really is, on helping people to live in godly relationship. And so through the nature of couples work, I obviously dealt with a lot of sex and a lot of sexual issues, a lot of infidelity, the gamut. And I had the privilege of being a part of a private practice with a lot of amazing, talented Christian sex therapists in my city. And so all of the therapists on our staff were all believers, but we ended up getting like all of the referrals from all of the Bible-believing churches in town because pastors were simply feeling overwhelmed with the number of sexual issues that were coming up among their congregations. So we would get all of the referrals. And so through that, it was kind of trial by fire, but I learned so much in my time there and through the amazing colleagues that I had. And so, like I say, I think God has really opened up this opportunity for me. And then since Seth and I have moved here, like I say, Brian has been so good just to champion this and to say we need to be having this conversation within the church. And I couldn't agree more. So that's just a little bit about my background. So my vision for people. This is my vision for you. This is my vision for myself, for all of the people that I work with. But I hate to see anything hinder all of us from knowing who God fully is, truly is, living out of our identities in Him, and really just integrating all the areas of our lives. So instead of compartmentalizing, which I know we can all be guilty of, that we would fully integrate our physical, emotional, spiritual, relational, everything selves, to live fully out of who God has created us to be. So really my philosophy on life and on people is that if we were all living fully out of the gifts and the talents that He has created us with, then the kingdom would come to the earth. So that's my vision for today. That's my vision for all of you. I just have to share with you all that so many people have been praying for this talk for each of you, both people within Cornerstone as well as friends outside of Cornerstone. I have some sex therapy friends that have been praying over this time together. So I'm just really excited about sharing this time with you. So I want to make it a little bit more personal. Even before I became a therapist, there's all the Harvey Weinsteins in the news, Matt Lauers. I mean, I'm sure I don't need to say all of the news and the media coverage on the many powerful men who've fallen recently. But long before any of that happened, Seth and I actually had a very dear friend to us. It was really Seth's first spiritual mentor in college, the man who very first discipled him, a dear brother in Christ to me. We had served on the worship team together. We'd also served overseas in some missions capacities. And he was a high school teacher who was found guilty of having sexual relations with a student, obviously lost his career over it. And I'm going to cry here, but dear, dear brother to us and friend. And gosh, I think that's the first wake-up call in my life where I realized none of us are immune to Satan's attacks, and just experiencing that on a very personal level with a man that we love. And so, sorry. So this is real, and more than the Matt Lauers and more than the Harvey Weinsteins, like, this has been the case for a lot of different men in my life. And so people that really love Jesus. So I would just hate to see anything like that derail you from being effective for the kingdom. So I'm very passionate about this topic. And if I can do my part to change culture and to bring some insight into this arena for you as men, then I will do that. So please don't interpret anything I say today as being condemnation or shaming from me, because that is not my heart and that is not my intent. I'm very fiery and I get very passionate about this topic. So there may be times where you feel like I'm maybe, on my soapbox here, but it's really because I'm in your corner and I am in this fight with you. That's why I do this work and that's why I'm passionate about it. So a couple of expectations for today. I will try to address all the questions that were submitted during the registration, or if I don't have time, so like I said, I have a lot of content to cover, I will try to direct you to resources. I will not solve all of your problems in the next hour, but I do hope that you are able to leave more informed with a greater understanding of the holistic nature of godly sexuality, and that you will seek out next steps, whatever those may be for you personally. I love C.S. Lewis, as many of you probably do, but he has two different quotes I really appreciate on desire. One is from Mere Christianity. He says, "Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger? Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim? Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire? Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. If that is so, I must take care on the one hand never to despise or be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other never to mistake them for the something else of which they are only a kind of copy or echo or mirage. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find until after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of life to press on to that other country and to help others do the same. And then he says in Weight of Glory, which this is probably my all-time favorite C.S. Lewis quote, "It would seem that the Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased." So I think he sums up desire really well. You know, God created us with earthly desires, even good desires. There's a purpose and a context for those things, so we shouldn't find shame in them. And there's a reason why he has created it for certain contexts. And I think the bigger picture here is that all desires that we experience point us to our ultimate desire for him. And it's only then that all of our desires will be fully fulfilled. So will you join me in prayer real quickly before I start? Father God, I just thank you for all the hearts in this room. I know it's absolutely no coincidence, each of the men that are here, that you brought them here personally. I pray that your spirit would just prepare their hearts, as you already have been, just to hear whatever it is that you would want them to take away from today, and that you would not have this be the only conversation that they're having on this topic, but just the beginning or another conversation, that they would definitely be real with you, that they would, if they're married, be real with their spouses, that they would be real with other men who they are in spiritual friendships with. And I just pray that you would cover this time, that whatever would be helpful and true, that those are the things that they would remember, and that each man would leave here not feeling ashamed, but rather feeling encouraged and like they have a greater passion for the vision for your kingdom and for their souls. Amen. Okay, so a couple things I want to say as a disclaimer: when to seek professional help. So if you have issues that have been persistent, usually causing distress and impairment of daily activities for 6 months or more, and this doesn't have to be just sexual, I would say this could be emotional, other things as well, definitely that might be something to consider pursuing professional counseling for. If you are experiencing some physical issues, such as erectile dysfunction, or if you're experiencing painful intercourse with your spouses, definitely something to check into with the help of a physician. Emotional issues, so if porn or sexual addiction has been an ongoing battle, if you've experienced an emotional or physical affair, if you're struggling with sexual identity, those types of things, traumas, sexual or otherwise, definitely things that would all benefit from professional counseling. But sometimes it could be small things too, you know, so some people tell me, well, I'm not really experiencing any major trauma in my life. Would I benefit from counseling? Even if it's something like difficulty communicating with your partner, which I appreciate Gary doing his EFT event. I cannot say enough great things about that. It's a research-based theory that's really effective with couples. So if you're having difficulty communicating with your partner, developing that emotional intimacy, that event would be great to go to, or even just personal insecurities that you've never really dealt with. So there's a wide range of things that you could seek professional help for. So I am not a medical doctor. I feel like I need to give that disclaimer because I do a lot of sex therapy work. I've learned a lot about the body and different things, but usually I always partner in practice with specialists in that area. So if you come to me and you have some different physical issues going on, I'll always partner with a medical professional, and there is a team of professionals that can really help you with whatever your needs are. Okay, I am a marriage and family therapist by training. I'm not currently licensed in Colorado, but I'm actually in the process of pursuing licensure. So after we moved here, Seth and I put that on hold for a while because we're in the process of developing like a holistic life coaching tool that helps people on a very practical daily basis, and we're excited to get ready to launch that soon. But I really miss being in the trenches with people, so I am pursuing going back hopefully soon. So if you feel like you would want to see me personally, you've got my contact information, definitely reach out. Or even if I can just be a resource for you, I love to work with unbelievers, but I especially love equipping the body. So if you have a quick question, you want some more information, feel free to reach out. Okay. So the way we're going to do this is I'm just going to go through the different questions that were submitted and try to interweave different points in, but I definitely want to focus on the things that you all asked. So we'll just dive right in with number 1. Should most families have internet controls on their devices? Absolutely yes. So your operating system and browser has some basic controls, but I would highly suggest a subscription program like Covenant Eyes. John has information. There's a group discount rate for people at Cornerstone. So if that's not something that you currently have on all of your devices, I would highly, highly encourage that. So there's a level of accountability because you can identify a trusted friend or mentor to identify that kind of they get information or reports on different things, but it's really great with content blocking. So especially if you've got kids, if you have kids coming over to your house, usually the average age of exposure to porn is 10. So some of you might be surprised by that, some of you may not. So definitely you want to protect your children especially too, and yourselves. How and when should a parent talk to their child about their sexual health? Well, this is a big question, so we could have a whole other session just on this topic alone, but I'll give you some high-level points, and then I'll give you a resource for the sake of time. So I would say you definitely need to be beginning in early childhood, even just educating your kids about their body parts. Call them what they are. Don't give them nicknames because that insinuates that there's something shameful or something that we need to change about them. So call them what they are. Educate your kids on body safety because we used to educate our kids on stranger danger. That's not really the case. As many of you probably know, sexual abuse happens mostly by people that are trusted and known. So instead, educate your kids on body safety, what's appropriate touch, what's safe touch, unsafe touch, and what to do if anyone breaks into their boundaries and has the unsafe touch with them. So you definitely want to be proactive about that. So my husband and I, this is funny, I'm not a big physical touch person. I regret saying that at the couples talk because now every person that hugs me at the Cornerstone is like, I'm sorry, I know you're not a physical touch person, but I'm going to hug you anyway. We are not big on PDA. However, I would encourage all married couples to show affection in front of your kids because what that does is it normalizes intimacy within the marriage, right? So it sets a foundation for your kids to be able to witness that intimacy happens within the marriage, and this is a safe place for it. This is a good place for it. So that's something that you can be doing all throughout your parenting. So those are some high-level points, but I will direct you to a website. So if you have your pen, you can take this down in your notes, but it's endsexualexploitation.org. It's an awesome resource, but there's a resource tab. You can specifically select parenting, and then there's a ton of resources, including books, articles, different things on how to talk about sex with your kids in different age categories, talking points in research about porn and other things. They have podcasts. They do a lot of activism in DC, which I love, and so I try to support a lot of their initiatives just on how they help with corporate change and different things like that. So endsexualexploitation.org. So I would direct you there for more explicit resources on parenting. Okay, next. What are the statistics for sexually active unmarrieds? So most of my research was from the Guttmacher Institute, which does research on sexual health, and then also the CDC. So under the age of 15, 13% of females and 18% of unmarried males have had sex. In 15 to 19-year-olds, 44% of females and 49% of males have had sex. 50% by the age of 19 have had oral sex, which don't get me started on that because a lot of teens, I think, are confused about what denotes sex, so a lot of them think that oral sex is not sex, which I would beg to differ. But interestingly enough, if they hadn't had sex, the number one reason given was that it was against their religion or morals. Number two was because they haven't found the right person. So I found that interesting. Now, I couldn't find specific statistics, college students and afterwards. However, I did find a stat that I thought was interesting about college students, that out of the 20 million new STDs or STIs reported every year between 15 to 24-year-olds, 10 million of those were reported in that age group. Not surprising. By the age of 44, if you are unmarried, 90% have had premarital sex. So those statistics are staggering. And as I've been praying for and preparing for this talk, I was just on my knees weeping sometimes, just because I hear all this stuff. I'm reading all these articles about all these guys that are coming out in the news, and it just feels overwhelming. It feels like there's just so much going on, but I do have to say, as much as I'm really glad for all the married men that are in this room, I'm really grateful for all of you singles that are here, because these are talks that I wish I would have heard when I was a single, that I think we need to be having conversations about. So I just feel a really heavy burden for singles. So if you're single and you're here, I'm so grateful. And I just want to share with you that most of the clients I worked with were actually 50s and up, a lot of middle-aged men and older. And they were dealing with midlife crises that were the result of the fallout of unaddressed sexual and other issues from their youth. So this is not a small thing, again. And like a lot of these men that are coming out in the news, there may be ages 50 to 80, and all of this stuff is coming out, but it's stuff over decades. So a big theme of what I'm going to say is, whatever you spend your time feeding, that's what's going to come out of you, and that's biblical. But I think that that's a big theme of what we're looking at. And my desire, although I like working with people in crises, my heart is to really be more proactive with people. So thank you, all of you, for being here, but especially you singles. I think it's a real gift. Okay, next question. How do you heal trauma from neglect, specifically from my father? Another question that is not easily answered. I would say it takes the Holy Spirit at work within you and some work. And so a couple of resources, though. John told me that he and Brian are actually going to be team teaching a class this spring on that specific topic. So if that's you fall into that category, great resource for you. Also, Destry's Healing Care class, and those materials are excellent, not necessarily to be a super deep dive, but it starts to create a level of awareness for different things that have happened in your life, maybe specific triggers that you have, and if they're unresolved, how they manifest in different ways. And so just getting to the spiritual connections with those things too. So that would be a great resource for you. Or you may benefit from personal counseling, so myself or Gary or Mary, or I know we have a lot of helping professionals here, even within our own body. Find someone that's a good fit for you. We all have different areas that we're really passionate about. So find someone that you're comfortable with if you feel like you need to process one-on-one issues with. And then obviously spiritual friendships and mentoring. So that's the whole purpose of this ministry. And I always tell, especially if I'm working with men, but all of my clients, I tell them, I am your counselor, but I am not your accountability. So I provide a measure of accountability, but ultimately I always want, especially for men, to have spiritual friendships with other men that can hold them accountable. And I think that's the purpose of the body and community. Okay. Okay, next. Please give a biblical apologetic for one's sexual ethics before marriage and after. In other words, what are permissible displays of affection for dating and engaged couples? Great question, whoever wrote this question. So I'm going to try to do this one justice, but I will direct you to a book. It's called Soul Virgins. It's by a sex therapist that I really respect and admire. But in short, he would say nothing that would be covered by a bikini. Like, those things should be off limits until the marriage relationship. However, there is obviously a lot of gray before that. So we're just going to look to some passages, and at the end of the day, you have to decide what you're comfortable with and what your convictions are. Although I will say, and I don't know that this was the intent of the person who asked the question, but I will say in society at large, I think we're asking the wrong question if we're asking, what can I get away with anything, not just sexually, but I think the question should be, how can I honor God with my body? And if you're dating or engaged, how can I ultimately lead my significant other into a deeper relationship with Christ and protect her? Because those things don't change once you get married. So that would be my caveat for that. But let's start off Job 31:1. Actually, Nick suggested this one because I didn't have it on my list. You want to share it real quick? great one for everyone. But 1 Corinthians 6:15-20, follow along if you want. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For, as it is written, the two will become one flesh. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body. That applies to all of us, whether you're single, dating, engaged, or married. Song of Solomon mentions twice, do not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. What does that look like on a practical level? That's for you to decide. So, another thing that I really love about men is they're usually like, tell me the answer, black and white, just tell me what to do. And you're probably going to be frustrated with me because a lot of my talk, there are some things where I will tell you a definitive answer, and there are a lot of areas where I hope to give you a frame of reference from a godly perspective, and you need to decide what that looks like. But I've worked with a lot of couples who maybe something that was acceptable for them in the physical realm during dating, they had to pull back and change during the engaged season because the temptation was all the higher. So, like I said, it looks different for every couple. Galatians 5:22-23, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. So a question that I get asked a lot, especially with engaged couples, is, well, especially if this is the person that I'm going to marry, why can I not have sex, right? Because that's a valid question. It's like, well, I haven't entered into the actual covenant yet. It hasn't been the wedding day, but I know I'm going to marry this person. So I get what you're saying about having sex with other people. My response to that would be a lot of things, but the fruit of the Spirit, I think, is huge. So again, I feel like for all of us, no matter what we're going through, sexually or otherwise, I think the point is that God is more about doing something in you than through you necessarily. One of my mentors told me that, and it's something that stuck with me, that he is about developing your character sometimes in times of trial rather than accomplishing great things through you. Not that he can't accomplish great things through you, but you have to be a person of character first. And so again, those fruits of the Spirit, if you look at the list, self-control, patience, love, like what true love really is, goodness, gentleness, all of those things, I would argue that purity during engagement and even the dating phase, or if you're single, is really a test from God to try to grow you in the fruits of the Spirit. Because again, those things just don't naturally happen when you become married, right? So all the married men can agree with that, but those are constantly things that the Lord is developing in and through us. Genesis 2:18-25. The Lord God said, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. Oops. And then he goes on to say, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, hold fast to his wife, they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Okay, I cannot emphasize this enough. John and I had a conversation prior to this morning, and he asked me, where do you think shame comes from? I think that's a common question that a lot of people ask. And what I would say, and I think theologian Wayne Grudem would agree, is that shame does not come from God, right? So when God created us, at the beginning of creation, they were naked and unashamed because they were living out of the context that he had designed for them. But then when the fall of man came and sin entered the world, that's when shame came into the picture. So with everything that I have to say today, I hope that you see, and this is what I wish that the church would have talked about a lot more when I was growing up as well, is that sex is not shameful. So I thought John's intro was beautiful about how we are so uncomfortable in our flesh, and that's part of the problem. We need to be more comfortable in our flesh. So sexuality in and of itself is not bad. If you are married, you definitely can embrace it. There's a lot of room for fun. We talked about some of that stuff at the couples session. And there's a reason why God designed it for a certain context, because if there is sin in that situation and you're not operating out of your sexuality as he designed for you to be, then that's when shame comes into the picture. So there's actually a lot more freedom if we live out of the context that he's designed for us. Genesis 4:1. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. So this concept here, yada, if you were at my couples talk, some of this will be repeat for you. But yada is Hebrew for the word knew, when it says Adam knew Eve and they conceived Cain. But the interesting thing that I learned about this is that that word know does not just mean laid with, like had physical relations with, but it's an all-encompassing knowing. So it's not only the physical act of sex, but it's an emotional knowing and a spiritual connection. And I think that's the piece that we're missing. So if we look at the Greek, there are a couple different types of love. So eros is where we get the word erotic, so that's alluding more to the physical kind of love. Philia is where we get the term for Philadelphia or the city of brotherly love, so that's more the friendship or the emotional connection. And then agape is the sacrificial, selfless kind of love like Christ has for the church, where he laid down his life for us as his bride. So what I would say to that is, so much in our society, especially with the younger generation these days, eros, only eros is happening. So I meet you on Tinder or whatever other app, and we're just going to have a one-night stand, a hookup, that's it. I don't even know you, it's just casual sex. If you have this other layer with philia, that's someone that you would say, oh, I'm in a friendship with this person. I even maybe like this person. Maybe it's someone you're dating, but I have no covenantal relationship with them, contract with them. So agape love, I would argue that agape love can only truly be fulfilled in marriage, because that is the only relationship where you have a covenantal commitment to your spouse to say, I will stick with you for better or for worse. Through the thick and thin, through all the good, the bad, and the ugly, I am with you, and we are constantly investing in our friendship, and we are expressing our physical love with one another. So that's the picture I want to give you of sex, that in marriage, it is all three, okay? And we'll refer back to that maybe a little bit later. Next question. What are normal expectations of frequency of intercourse for married couples? Another person asked it this way. Is there a frequency of sexual intimacy that is considered optimal for physical and relational health of a couple? Again, not a black and white answer. However, I would say 1 Corinthians 7, 3-5 says, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband, for the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So it always has to be mutually agreed upon by the couple. However, there are going to be different situations in life, right? Like painful or uncomfortable intercourse during pregnancy or menopause, perhaps. If there's a surgery or other physical health issues, definitely. Like I said, I worked with a lot of vets. So if you're deployed overseas because you're in the military or you travel a lot because of work, there are different creative ways that you can manage that. So talk to me if that's your situation and you're thinking, it's really hard for me to figure out how to engage intimacy with my wife because I'm gone so much. But I would say as a whole, if there's an extended time of abstinence, you definitely need to discuss that, agree upon it. The caveat I would give here is, for sure, if sexual addiction is in the picture, then that's something that definitely clouds and skews all of this. And so we're going to talk about the neuroscience behind sex and addictions a little bit later. But with that, you can almost be on like a hyperdrive with your sex drive. So if porn is a regular part of your practice, if addiction is definitely in the picture, then that skews all of that. So it becomes a situation where even if you are married, it can seem more like a transaction, right, with your spouse. Like, I deserve this, I'm married. You could even quote this scripture and say, well, it says that we're not supposed to deprive each other, so give me what's due me. And I would say that is completely the wrong attitude, again, and not this agape, selfless kind of sex that we're talking about. So, okay, next question. What is not normal according to most research? Again, I'm not sure of the context here, so if you're talking about some sexual disorders, that'll be the next question we'll address. I don't know if you're asking like based on fetishes or abnormal attraction, so I'll just tell you a quick story. And again, we're going to cover some of the neuroscience a little bit later, but thought it might be interesting to give you guys some stories of real people. So with non-identifying information, of course. But there was a gentleman that I worked with. They came to me when they were engaged, I believe, or newlyweds, and he was just crying in my office saying, I'm really attracted to this woman right here. More than just physically, I'm attracted to her heart. I'm attracted to who she is spiritually. But I've had a long-standing addiction that's really tough to break. And I'm like, okay, what is it? Thinking it's going to be, some of what I've seen before. And he said, I'm just so ashamed to say this, but I have a fetish with pregnant women. So it started from a young age. He found himself aroused whenever he saw a pregnant woman, and so then he acted out on that. It got to the point where he was seeking out images of pregnant women to be able to masturbate to, and then it escalated to the point where he had legal action taken against him for taking photographs of pregnant women in public places. So, as you can imagine, devastating, unique kind of attraction, if you will. Here he is now, wanting to marry his love, and he's like, I cannot break this cycle. So in short, again, we're going to get into the neuroscience a little bit later, but I would say that with attractions, you can have different things that you are, different people that you're attracted to. That in and of itself is not a bad thing. God created us to appreciate his creation. So that in and of itself is not sin. But what you choose to do with that is huge. And with attraction, I would say, especially with the brain science out there, whatever you feed will grow. Okay, so that's the short of it, is that you can have attractions and they can create deeper neural pathways in your brain if that's what you feed and that's what you act on. So there are a lot of ways to redirect that. The hope is that you can change those neural pathways and you can heal from all of that. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. All that to say, fast forward, they're married, they're parents, they're doing really, really well. So we were able to do some different things to change those neural pathways. Okay, let's see. Oh, okay, what are some common sexual disorders? So there would be some different categories of sexual disorders. There are some having to do with desire. For sure, if you are a man 50 or over, please get your testosterone levels checked because they tend to dip, and then you wonder what's wrong with your level of desire. That can be easily fixed with a testosterone patch or different shots. If you are on medications for blood pressure, antipsychotics, antidepressants, sedatives, antacids, or even alcohol, those things can definitely create a hamper on your desire. So again, things that you can work with your physician on, especially if you're saying, man, this is really affecting my sex life. Is there something else that I could get on that would accomplish the same thing for my health that wouldn't necessarily have these kinds of side effects? With arousal disorders, there's definitely erectile dysfunction. Could be caused by diabetes or cardiovascular disease because of lack of blood flow. It could be due to a psychological block due to anxiety. And a lot of you may be surprised to hear this, but masturbation is a huge cause of erectile dysfunction as well as premature ejaculation. There's secular research that backs this up. There are a lot of studies that have been done out there, but especially in the military, they're having alarming rates of young men, 30 and under, who are coming in with erectile dysfunction. So I don't need to explain to you that I think a lot of that's due to masturbation. They've directly correlated it in the studies just with the availability of porn and everything that's out there. So that's what I wish we were talking about with our single men, right? So it's not that God's depriving you, but if you are doing this and it's not in God's design, then it's actually going to hinder your sex life. That's the kind of stuff that we're not talking about in society. Again, there are ways that we can help that. So you're not just, stuck with that situation, but it requires some work and some changes. With premature ejaculation, there are also different exercises that can be done for that. So that's usually not a lifelong sentence. With orgasm, there are different disorders regarding delay or absence of orgasm. And again, not necessarily abnormal, but they are common. So they could be due to physical, psychological, or pharmacological reasons. And then there are different pain disorders, primarily affecting women. Actually, that's one of the most common issues that I see with couples is females experiencing pain disorders. Again, something that's very easily resolvable, like 99% of the time. So if that's your situation with your spouse, please don't struggle in silence, because that's something that we can definitely help with. Okay. Next, what are typical sexual stages that married couples go through as they get older? Again, not sure of the person who's asking this what they consider older, but I'll try to address this. So obviously having kids at the home is going to present stress and distraction, right? You might have to be a little bit more creative about what your sexual intimacy looks like. However, once kids are launched and couples are 50 or 60 and over, with the exception of some common problems like insufficient lubrication for women going through menopause or erectile dysfunction due to testosterone levels dropping, as I've already mentioned, or other health issues, sex, even though it tends to be less frequent for older couples like empty nesters, it can actually be more enjoyable for them. And here's why. Because we talked about the eros, philia, agape concept, this holistic picture of intimacy, not just being about the physical intimacy. So older couples tend to be more in tune with themselves, to be more in tune with their spouses, to feel a higher level of connection and comfort. And that's not a coincidence. So actually, for older women, they have the potential to experience a lot more orgasms later on in life because of that level of connection and comfort. So that's interesting. Next, what is an emotional affair? So, great question. Emotional affairs happen in about 1 out of every 4 marriages, which is about the same frequency as physical affairs are happening. So, I would define an emotional affair, or really any affair, as a person other than your spouse is fulfilling some kind of need that your spouse isn't. So, with emotional affairs, it's not as easy to pinpoint, right? It's easy to justify because you can say, well, I'm not physically involved with this person, so there's not a problem there. However, I would say that it can do just as much damage. I've seen it do just as much damage as physical affairs with clients I've worked with. But really, at the end of the day, it's that you feel a level of connection with someone other than your spouse. And again, that in and of itself is not bad, right? Because we all have friends. You're going to have friends of the opposite sex, and we live in community together. And I think that's the beauty of having both men and women. I know Brian's preached on masculinity before. There's a great value to having friends, and even friends of the opposite sex. However, if you are starting to invest a lot more time and energy and attention in someone of the opposite sex other than your spouse, that's when there becomes a problem. If you find yourself thinking about this other person more, feeling more encouraged by this other person, feeling like you can't wait until you see them, all of those types of things, then it makes sense that you're taking more of the intimacy and directing that attention to this other person other than your spouse. In general, with all affairs, I would say it's fantasy versus reality. So essentially, or with porn too, right? So you're in a real relationship with a real human being, probably your spouse, and this person has flaws and sins, and you're seeing them up close and personal on a day-to-day level. So you see the good and the bad and the ugly. You see when they sin, things aren't always easy. You have communication problems. You have sexual problems. You fight. You have the stresses of the daily grind, and if you've got children, definitely stresses. And then usually it happens in the workplace or with other friends. You go to the workplace or you're in these other environments and you just see the pretty parts of this other person over here. And you think, gosh, they're just so much fun to be around. And man, they just really encourage me. They affirm who I am as a man. They compliment me on my work and my abilities. And you start to feel really puffed up by that. And so it's really easy to compare the realities of your spouse and what you see on a day-to-day basis with the fantasy world of this other person, because you're not necessarily dealing with the ins and outs of life with them. Same with porn. There are women that are always beautiful, that always look like they want you, and the reality is that real relationships take work, and they're not all easy. So, my husband and I are guilty of, believing the lie that if it's right, it's going to be easy. It's going to be happy, right? That's the bad theology that we all fall into, especially with marriage, is, well, God wants us to be happy. So the world would tell you, if you're not happy, go find someone who will make you happy. If you're having problems, don't worry about it. There's somebody else over here. The grass is greener on the other side. Do you, especially in Boulder. But I would say that's nowhere in the Bible does it say that. And not to say that we can't have happiness. There's a lot of happiness and a lot of fruit that comes, but that doesn't necessarily come without hard work. So, Seth and I are very open about our marriage, but I would say we always tell people that if it were not for Jesus and our commitment to him and ultimately to each other, that within the first 4 years of marriage, we would have easily been divorced. So I say that to encourage you because there is fruit that can come out of it, even the hard stuff, even affairs and things like that. But Proverbs 4:23 says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. In Matthew 22:37, Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. So that means your thoughts, feelings, will, and actions. Those things aren't just easily happening, like our thoughts, feelings, will, and actions don't just naturally go towards holy desires. So it takes a lot of work and effort to do that, and I would say accountability too, and like I said, spiritual friendship. Next question, if a spouse has been unfaithful sexually with another person, should they tell their spouse? Great question. In short, my answer is always yes. There are other therapists, even Christian therapists, that would disagree with me. Some therapists out there would say, oh, if it's not currently going on and it's something from your past, why rock the boat? Why bring up something that's going to upset your spouse? I would say that it's more about, again, what God is doing in your heart and the character that he's developing in you, and the redemption that you have with him, and ultimately to the reconciliation that's possible between you and your spouse, to not have anything hidden. I think it's all of those things working together, and that's why I would actually argue, yes, you definitely want to disclose that. However, I would say I wouldn't do that on your own. I would strongly recommend the help of a professional with that, especially someone who has experience working with affairs and sexual addiction, because that's not easy stuff to go through. You've got a lot of different parts to manage, a lot of different emotions to manage. There's the person who's struggling with the addiction and the reason why he acted out. So you've got to deal with those root issues. You've got to manage the couple relationship and the spouse who feels betrayed, those emotions, and then ultimately building on the reconciliation and the healing there. So, a couple of thoughts on this. So Job 12:21-23 says, he uncovers the deeps out of darkness and brings deep darkness to light. John 12:46-47, I've come into the world as light so that whoever believes in me may not remain in darkness. If anyone hears my words, does not keep them, I do not judge them, for I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. Ephesians 5:8-14, for at one time you were in darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of the light, for the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true. Try to discern what's pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of the things that they do in secret, but when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. 1 John 1:6-8. If we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light, as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his son, cleanses us from all of our sin. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. So that's my evidence, hopefully, that's compelling for exposing the things that we hide. And not just sexual sin, but I think whatever that is that you feel like you haven't been vulnerable about, I think there's definitely fruit that comes both in our relationship with Jesus as well as our relationship with one another and your spouses, if that stuff is exposed. So let's talk a bit about the neuroscience. This is stuff I get really excited about. I'm sorry if there's a scientist in the audience, because I'm definitely not a scientist, but I just love what I do understand about neuroscience. So there are a couple of different things at play when it comes to sex or really any kind of addiction. So there's dopamine, which is in charge of reward and memory. There's norepinephrine, which is in charge of memory as well. Testosterone, in charge of arousal and desire. Oxytocin and vasopressin, in charge of bonding and attachment. And serotonin, which is in charge of calm. So let's talk about how some of those things work together, especially with the act of sex. And when I say sex, that includes masturbation. So anytime that you are experiencing ejaculation outside of like a wet dream where it's just like a function of your body. But if you are experiencing ejaculation, then essentially the dopamine is being activated. So it's giving you a sense of pleasure, right, at the reward center. that and norepinephrine are burning that experience into your memory. The testosterone is amped up, so the arousal desire piece. The oxytocin and vasopressin helps you to create an attachment to that memory. And then the serotonin gives you that feeling of calm or release afterwards. So what are the implications of all of those things working together? So essentially, I work with a lot of people who, well, let's talk about sexual identity. If you're struggling with sexual identity, I've worked with tons of adolescents and older men as well who think that they're homosexuals because when we go back to it, kind of like that situation that I told you about with the guy who was attracted to pregnant women, that's what they've fed all of their lives, right? And so maybe that was an initial experience for them where they felt aroused, but then they kept on feeding or fueling that attraction, and that's what's cemented in their memory, and that's what they're attached to. So they're always trying to recreate that. So they say, well, I must be homosexual because this is it. And when we talk about early sexual experiences, that's usually what it goes back to. Similarly, if you're heterosexual, I think so many times when affairs happen, it's because married men are trying to recreate the excitement and the sexual experience that they had early on. Say their first sexual encounter was in high school or something like that, prior to marriage. It's like they're trying to recreate that. So there are serious implications. If you're addicted to porn and you've consistently masturbated to certain images, you are cementing that experience in your brains. And so that's what I mean when I say whatever attraction you feeds grows. Okay, so here are some of the other aspects of that. So, say you're masturbating, and the piece, especially with oxytocin and vasopressin, creating bonding and attachment. What are you bonding to? Okay, so this is a huge concept I think to be thinking about. Is essentially you're creating an attachment to yourself, as well as to whatever images or fantasies that you were acting out with, instead of your wife if you're married. So I think that the implications here are just huge, because you think about what you're creating attachment to, what you're bonding with. And so I know a lot of people that think, oh, since I'm not sexually active with another person, if I'm not married, then I'm doing okay, right? Well, I would argue if you're consistently masturbating, probably not a good thing, because you're creating those neural pathways and they're digging deeper and deeper. So again, the problem with a lot of the research saying that so many more men are struggling with erectile dysfunction, it's so interesting because it's like you've so developed this bondage and attachment to self-reliance, or focusing on a fantasy to arouse you, that when then you are with a real person in this kind of a relationship in marriage, it's really difficult to perform. And again, that's more of what we are not talking about, that I so wish we were. So, and with affairs too, this takes work to develop this holistic picture of sexuality, but it's so worth it, because intimacy, I think godly intimacy, is not only about the sexual, but it's about the emotional, and it's about the friendship and all of those connections, the spiritual connection. And without that, that's only one part of the picture, and we're totally missing out on all of these other parts. So think about the person who only has sex with their marriage partner. They are creating a bonding attachment experience with their spouse. That's what they're investing in. Whenever you think about reward and memory, those are the memories they're cementing in their memory. Those are the things that get them excited, because that's what they're feeding. They're feeding intimacy with their spouse. So that would be my my vision for all of you, whether you're single or married, to really think about how that works. And I know, I appreciate this because I'm a learner, and I know a lot of men are wired this way, which I think is probably why I've worked with so many men in my practice. But I think it's not enough for the church and for society at large to say, don't have sex until marriage. I don't think that's enough. I think that's only one part of the picture, but really a lot of people want to know why. tell me why. So I hope that I'm able to give you a compelling vision, both spiritually from God's word, as well as understanding some of the neuroscience and the research and the physiology behind it, of this is why, that God created our bodies and our brains this way so that we would flourish when we are operating sexually out of who he's created us to be, that there's a purpose and a vision for that context. Okay. I'm going to tell you a story real quick about actually the clients that Seth had the privilege to meet that he was talking about with the event. So these people are so dear to my hearts, but I worked with them very consistently for a very long time. But he was a military man, so rough and tough guy, had been deployed multiple times overseas, and they came to me broken because it was discovered that he had a pretty serious sexual addiction. And then in the weeks that followed, more and more came out where he would say, well, I wasn't completely honest with you, first session or second session, but really this has been for decades. I've solicited prostitutes for decades. And these people had been married, have children that are in their teens, and I didn't know if they were going to make it, quite honestly. The wife was so torn up about that, and I will never forget, I shared this at the couples night, but many men, but especially him specifically, he wept on my couch, y'all. He wept, and he looked at me and he said, I've considered myself a Christian this whole time. We've been a part of an awesome church. I've been serving there for decades, and I was never real with who I really was. And just what my behavior, the impact of my behavior. And he's like, I've been absent in my marriage. I've been absent in my parenting, but I don't want to lose them. I don't want to lose my wife. And so we did a lot of hard work for a long time. And he was able to tell me through tears, I now understand a much fuller picture of who Jesus is. And that is the beautiful picture of hope that I want to encourage you all with, that don't struggle alone. You are not alone. This is happening across the scale. And at the same time, I think there's no more beautiful picture of the gospel and Jesus giving his life for us while we were still sinners. So I think he was finally able, through all of that, when all of the darkness that he'd been hiding from came to light, and he exposed all of that, just the work that we were really able to do, and for him to find his true identity in Christ, and to know that in spite of all of those things that came out, his wife stood by his side and worked with him, encouraged him, and loved him. It wasn't easy at first, but he said, this is the first real picture I've ever had of God's unconditional love for me. And so if you've never fully embraced that and owned that and understood what that means for yourself personally, I just really challenge you to accept that and embrace that. How are we doing on time here? What time do I need to wrap things up, John? Okay. I will say, if you are struggling, not just with sexual addictions, but any other addictions as well, there's a great resource I want to point you to. It's at Flatirons Church, and it meets on Friday nights. It's called Shift. So it's essentially like an accountability group of sorts. I've heard it's huge. There's lots of people that go, so it's not going to be like you're sitting there with a small group of people awkwardly twiddling your thumbs, but they split up gender specifically. So men are with men, women are with women, and then they split up for different types of addictions. So sexual addictions, men are going to be in one group. If you have substance or other kind of addiction, then they split you up like that. And so I would say that's not necessarily in place of individual counseling. However, I would say that definitely can be a resource for you, where you can be with other people of the same gender to have some encouragement and support from a godly perspective as you're walking that journey. And then I also know for sure that John said, if you are in search of that kind of spiritual accountability, please talk to him, and either he personally or someone else here at Cornerstone would love to meet with you on that spiritual accountability type of level. Okay, Last question that was submitted. What is the number one book or resource that you would suggest for growing in intimacy with my wife? Great question. Again, not sure of the context here because there's lots of different components to intimacy as we've discussed. So if whoever wrote that question would just come up and talk to me afterwards, give me a little bit of the context that you're thinking. If you're thinking like emotional intimacy, if you're thinking sexual intimacy, if there are specific questions that you've got around that. I love a lot of different resources out there, and so I'd love to be able to give you a recommendation that's more specific. So in closing, I just want to read Ephesians 5:25-31. It says, "Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband." That is the big picture concept that we're talking about. You know, that sex ultimately, all intimacy, but sex especially, is very symbolic of Christ's relationship with us. So that eros, philia, and agape love, all of it, the all-knowing yada sex. So with those concepts in mind, I think we just have to have a bigger picture of God's intention for intimacy, for God's intention for sex. And so I think that applies whether you're single, dating, engaged, or married. I hope that that's something that you have been able to embrace today, to maybe think about. I hope this is not the end of the conversations, but maybe rather the beginning or a furthering of conversations that you can have with other men in your life. Again, I'd love to be a resource for you. If you want to come up and talk to me afterwards, I'll be available for a little bit, or you can reach out to me via email or phone. But I just thank you so much for your time today, and I just wish you God's blessing as you fight the good fight.